Sorry. Okay. So tonight is Yom Hashoa in Israel, and also in England they just had a ceremony, I believe, and it's an interesting time to be in Chutz La'aretz. In Israel. You feel Yom Hashoa much more, but I assume also in England, especially in the schools, they run activities and everything else. But I always, I run trips to Poland, and I've guided in Poland, and one thing which I always like to do on Yom HaShoah is learn one of the tshuvot that were written by Rav Oshry in his Responsa called the Mima Makim, and to go through one and to see and to learn it and to kind of get a sense of what people were dealing with in times of the Shoah. Obviously, we have a number of written records from the time of the Shoah. We have famously the Esh Kodesh, the drashot of the Rebbe of Piaseczna, who was in the Warsaw Ghetto, and there are a number of other writings and texts and stories that came out that tie into Yiddishkeit in the ghettos, and also in terms of tshuvot as well. Rav Oshry himself was in the Kovno Ghetto. He wasn't. Sometimes people like to say he was the chief, or like the rabbi of the Kovno Ghetto. He wasn't. He was the assistant to the rabbi, but he was asked questions in that role, and he didn't write the tshuvot in the Shoah. He wrote them. They were compiled afterwards. I think they were published in 1959. But you see, or the breadth of questions that he got. It's not only questions of life and death, which are obviously very pertinent in the Shoah, and there are very famous ones that people always learn about from Rav Oshry. There are also more mundane questions, about can you use wood stolen from the Germans to make a sukkah in the ghettos? Questions like that, which you see Jews are dealing with these questions. A mitzvah baba avera, but obviously he's not talking about stealing wood from the Germans. He's talking about wood from the Germans that was really stolen from someone else, and all these very, very difficult situations. And tonight I thought we would look at one of his tshuvot dealing with the halachic concept of pikuach nefesh lachar zman, right? That's how we called it in the halachic literature. Also because a little bit lahavdil mamash, it has a bit of relevance for the discussions that are going on today around COVID, right? And at what point does pikuach nefesh take over, and the complexities in deciding those things. And one of the complexities is pikuach nefesh lachar zman. Everyone agrees that pikuach nefesh is relevant. If it's safek pikuach nefesh, you do whatever you have to do. But the question is not if it's pikuach nefesh now, but if it's something that you need to do now to prevent a state of being in safek pikuach nefesh later. And that already is a more difficult question to answer. And that also we've kind of seen hints of, I think, in also mamash lahavdil, seen hints of in this time period, right? When a Rav gets a question about, am I allowed, when some of the leading Hasidic Rebbe's say, we're going to open the schools, right? And everyone turns around and says, but it's pikuach nefesh. Well, it's not really pikuach. It is pikuach nefesh, but it's not exactly pikuach nefesh. It's more complex than that, because on a day-to-day basis, we make decisions that are that endanger lives, and we decide to take the risk for whatever reason because it's questions of public policy. A good example is, driving to work, right? You can make the argument that driving to work is highly dangerous, so therefore pikuach nefesh, don't drive to work. Right, everything, you stop everything, you don't do anything. But obviously, that's a very extreme example. And I'm not saying we shouldn't listen to the health authorities, especially now. I'm just saying that when it comes to questions of pikuach nefesh, it's more complex than just, well, if there's any hint of anything to do with pikuach nefesh, we go, we go l'chumra on everything. And in some respects, this she'ela that Rav Oshry deals with is touching on that point exactly. And obviously the situation in the ghettos and the camps was entirely different from COVID, but there are similarities and things to perhaps think about. So B'ezras Hashem, our learning should be Lilu Nishmat HaKadoshim that were nisbei in the Shoah, and let's begin. We'll read the tshuva as it comes on the inside, so to speak. and we'll see his Rav Oshry's thinking. Let me just share my screen. Okay, so I hope everyone sees it. And he says like this: She'ela, the question, B'yom Kav Zayin Elul, on the date of 27th of Elul, Utal Yudei Ghetto Kovna, right? It was placed upon the Jews of the ghetto, La'avod B'vinyan Sde Tufa Al Yad Ha'ir. They had to build a airport next to the city. V'nitan Hatzav Al Yidei Garinim Hazedim Arurim Yimach Shemam, and the order was given by the Germans that they should be cursed. Shal Yudei Ghetto Lishloch Midei Yom B'Yom Michseh Shel Elef Ish She'avdu B'Sder Tufa. The Jews from the ghetto to send 1,000 people every day to do this work. L'kol echad ve'echad m'ovnei ha'kfiyah nitan b'tor mazon tzalachat shel marak pigul. Right, and each of the workers that were forced to work were given as food one bowl of soup, which was not kosher. Many of them did not want to make themselves impure. Right. Also in the background here, you hear, for those who have done surva, you hear also this kind of natural kind of stepping back from eating tray food. It's not only about the simple halacha. There's a deeper side to this. So we also say, trefot metamtemet halev, right? It has a kind of a spiritual impact on the heart, and it's not so pashut to eat trefot. We should also know ulit kel v'litomim rakzeh, right? And they were discussed. They didn't want a taste of the marak, right? Olam mikevan shem nichlashu mira'av u'mi'oni u'mirov avodah, since they became weak from hunger and suffering and from all the work. Ba'olai ben keser le'esor, they came to me, but in aseret yemei tshuva, right? A number of people. V'nasham lishol higia imutar lem lechol tamarak. They wanted to know if they can eat the soup. Heyot ki yesh b'zeh mishum sakana nefashot b'im yamshichu b'ra'avonam. They asked if they could eat the soup, if and because if they would continue like this, they would it would be a sakanat nefashot, right? And so you see from here the nature of the question, the nature of the response, and we'll see how he answers this question, which in of itself is very, very interesting. I would just say, and I've said this before, by reading the Tshuvot, what we're actually reading is another historical telling of the Shoah, right? In Haredi circles, there is no real writing of history like perhaps in more academic circles and or in the academic world, right? So how do you tell the story of the Shoah? You tell it by stories, and you also tell it through Tshuvot, through Shutim. So when Rav Oshry writes his Shutim, he's also telling us the nature of the Shoah, right? And it's one way in which people can learn about the Shoah and learn about what people went through. I will just say, kind of giving context for this discussion, there are a few things to bear in mind. This comes through in a number of other she'elot and tshuvot, not only by Rav Oshry, but by other people, that eating meat and treif meat or any meat in the Second World War, and even before the invention of tofu and other vitamins and stuff, was necessary anyway. You couldn't really survive properly and healthily for long without eating meat, and that's also part of the context for the questions. You also know that in other ghettos and in other places, I think in Ghetto Lodge, for instance, the Rabbanim, as we'll see, gave a similar psak that you're allowed to eat, right? And in fact, I'll just share with you one other source. Sorry, let me just pull it up. Share screen. One other source here. It's a English translation of something written by Rav Aronson, right? Who was in the Konin ghetto, right? He was a young Rav at the time, and he writes here. Should one regularly say blessings over the food and foods one eats to fend off starvation? And he writes, this is the case that happened. It was my habit to recite the blessing Shakol Nia Bidvaro, in which we thank God by whose word everything exists over permitted foods, ingredients in the food or the water. In doing this, I had in mind that everything that happens to us, including being forced to eat non-kosher food to stay alive, is the result of God's will, word and will, right? And he writes like this. right? In one of his books. I noticed that many Jews were uncertain about whether to eat the non-kosher soup, and I realized that this was endangering lives. Therefore, I took up a spoonful of soup, recited the blessing aloud, Shakolni Abidvor, and ate it. I explained to the onlookers that Shakolni Abidvor means that everything that happens to a person is of the Creator's will. We are duty bound to live and sustain our souls. My remarks had the desired effects. Almost everyone ate the soup. And so you see, it's not only Rav Oshry dealing with this question, other Rabbanim are dealing with this question. They deal with it from other angles, right? And there you see perhaps a Rav who felt the need to make clear to everyone that this is what we need to be doing. And he stood up and he made the bracha, and he also explains how he could make the bracha and what he was thinking at the time. And he rules, and he doesn't only rule, he also shows everyone that they need to, because people inherently don't want to eat the tray food. And again, so getting back to what I was saying, in the Lodge ghetto, there was a group of people who came out against the Rabbanim, right? The Rabbanim said you should eat the horse meat that was given in the Lodge ghetto, and a group formed called Pek Kadosh that said we're not going to eat trefot, and they gave reasons why not. And they kind of went around and as activists trying to encourage people dafka not to eat the treif meat, which was really a case of sakanat nefashot. But again, you get the sense that there's more going on with the eating of trefot than simply halacha. Even though obviously we need to keep halacha, but the natural inclination of people is to take a step back and say I don't want to do that. And you see that coming through also in this question of Rav Oshry. Does anyone want to say anything or ask? Okay. So let's go on. Let's read more of the Teshuva, and we'll see Rav Oshry's response. I hope we have enough time. I said just half an hour because after the tekes, I thought maybe people might be a bit tired. It's also late anyway. And he explains the topic. Okay, so he begins like this, and he says, "Masechet Yoma." We have this. Right? A doctor, a sick person is fed according to experts, right? And this is a famous Gemara. And Amar Rav Yanai. Rav Yanai though says, Chole omer tzarich, ve'rofe omer eino tzarich, shomim lechole. Right? Rav Yanai says, if a sick person says he needs to eat, and a doctor says the sick person doesn't need to eat, you listen to the chole. My tama, what's the reason? Lev yodat marat nafsho. The reason is the pasuk, which is the heart knows the pain of what's going on. The sick person knows what's good for him, right? And he also knows the depths of what he's going through, and therefore he knows whether he needs to eat or not. By the way, just as a side, for those who are interested, just because it's kind of relevant here, but there was just recently an article written by someone called Dr. Judah Goldberg, who was actually my wife's neighbor in Teaneck. He's an emergency doctor, and he's a tremendous Talmid Chacham. He teaches in some yeshivot in Israel, and he just wrote an article in Tradition about which argued basically and received the haskamot of Rav Hershel Shechter and Rav Mordechai Willig, in which he argued that there should be more information given to sick people, and there should be more leeway for sick people to sometimes refuse treatment. And it's not only based on this Gemara, but it just reminded me. So if you want to look at that article, it was out recently. I think it's for free on their website. It's connected to this anyway. But you see from here that according to this, a doctor, if a doctor says don't feed and the sick person says feed, you listen to the sick person because their heart knows. Shita, right? This is simple, right? This is clear. The heart knows, right? The person knows the depth of it. So why does the verse need to teach us this? Ma'udatema, what would you come to say? Rofe kim leitfe. You would say a doctor is more established, right? Is more expert, and therefore you need to listen to him. Kamashmala, and therefore the verse teaches us no, you need to listen to the heart of the sick person, and you need to go, right? Rofe omer tzarich v'chol omer eino tzarich. Shomim l'rofe my tama tun vahu d'nakitle. Right? If a doctor says he needs to eat, and a sick person says he doesn't need to eat, you listen to the doctor because perhaps the sick person is not thinking 100% clearly, right? And then we're not going to get into this because we're a bit short of time already. But he brings here a Rosh which has a different girsa of the Gemara. And what comes out in the Rosh at the end is Alma dafka mishum safek mitamachilinoto, right? Therefore, it's only when, based on this different girsa, that due to it's doubtful whether he's going to die or not, you feed the person. And then he says, right? And he says, this suffix is a big chumrah. It leads to a big case of people being very makbid, because what it seems to suggest is only when the doctor says it's really a case of suffix mita, of perhaps the person is going to die, do we eat? But when it's not a case of suffix mita, we don't eat. Right? And he says this is a big chumrah because doctors don't say that. Doctors say, rather, doctors say, if he doesn't eat, he's going to get weak, and therefore, and then it'll come in danger. He doesn't actually say it's a case of life and death for him to eat, right? And right? And then he goes on and brings the tour. And this is the words of the tour. A sick person that needs to eat. If there is an expert doctor there, right? He says if you don't give him the food, it's possible that the illness will become greater for him. And he'll become endangered. And therefore, he doesn't talk about whether you're suffix mita or not. It's just enough for the person to become endangered. Machilinoto. You feed the sick person, al piv, according to what the doctor said, and the doctor doesn't need to say it's a life and death, right? Because this ties directly to our case of what we're talking about, right? What we've spoken about until now is this case of the ghetto, right? And Jews go every day to work and they get a little bit of food, and it's clear that if they don't eat the soup today, they'll live tomorrow, right? And they'll live perhaps the day after and perhaps the day after that. But then if they haven't eaten already for 3 or 4 or 5 days, it'll become to a situation they're working heavily every single day, right? That then they'll be in danger, right? So the question is whether they should be allowed to eat today, even though they're not in danger today, or whether you need to wait until they're really in a situation of life and death in order to start feeding them, right? Or start allowing them to eat. And so we learn from this Gemara in Yuma, right? And the other girsa of the Rosh, that it seems to suggest that only when the doctor says the person is suffix mita, he's about to, or he might die if he doesn't eat, do you feed the person? And so here Oshry comes and says, no, you see in the tour that that's not the case. That what it means, that even if the doctor comes and says that there's a suffix that if he doesn't eat, it's going to make him worse, you feed him. Meaning that opens up the doors to say that in a case today where the person goes out to work and if he doesn't eat the soup, you'll be okay tomorrow. And even the day after that, still in that case, we would argue from a halachic perspective that you need to eat the soup, the treif soup. So is that clear to everyone?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just carry on in the tour. Right? Even if he said his sickness will get worse and he'll become into danger, automatically we feed him. Even if he doesn't say he'll definitely come into danger, right? It's possible he'll come into danger. We feed him the klal gadol hu b'torah safek nefashot la'akel. Anything that has to do with safek pikuach nefesh, we are mekel, right? And that is the shit of the Tur. And according to this, haoleh lanu ma'amuva, right? And again, this is only the beginning of the tshuva, and it's not so long, but it's still more to come. It comes out from this shedin shepikuach nefesh eino nimdad imotah sha'asha choleh omed ba. Right? It comes out from this that the din of pikuach nefesh isn't judged by the time when you ask the question right? Rather, even if at that time there isn't actually pikuach nefesh, in any case, since later It's possible that the sickness will get worse as miyad yesh alav din shebikuach nefesh, immediately as the din of pikuach nefesh, and you feed him on Yom Kippur, right? Velafize nidun dedan. Therefore, in our case, yesh la'atir lehem le'echol tamarak mishum pikuach nefesh. Therefore, in our case, you should let people eat the soup immediately, even if they're not going to be sick today. Because even if at that particular time there's no actual endangerment to their life, since they're going to become sick later, they'll come to a dangerous place. It's permissible for them to eat from the soup, the treif soup. And especially since, according to the opinion of specialist doctors, it's impossible for people to live in conditions like the Jews lived then, right? And you also hear from here that he's writing the Teshuva later, right? As a Teshuva, he was asked, and he composed the writings later. Certainly, there is a question of pikuach nefesh, right? And we also learn, and he brings a pasuk here, based on Yirmiyahu and Bava Batra, that Rav is worse than death, right? Anything later in the pasuk is worse than the one that came before it, right? And here in the pasuk it says lamut lamut, lecherev lecherev, lerav lerav. Rav comes later in the pasuk, and therefore it is worse than death. And again, the description of Rav by the Jews in the Shoah, it's a thing that gnaws at you, right? You can't sleep, right? You can't think properly, right? And it really is a torment, and certainly it leads to a case of pikuach nefesh. One other thing to keep in mind as well is that part of what he's doing, and this is actually the job of a posek in every door, right? And is to lead the way for people, right? And to kind of guide people to the right way of halacha. And part of what he's doing is explaining to people why they should do this, why it's necessary for halacha, in terms of halacha, for them to do this, and probably dealing with the people around who raise all kinds of halachic questions about this. And it's not just an answer, right? He's trying to lead the way and teach people why dafka they should, and perhaps there are many people that didn't want to anyway. And so he needs to give significant halachic backing and deal with all of the questions, obviously. Okay, let's carry on, because he doesn't just leave it at that. And he says like this, Olam, right? But all of this, you can say, is only talking about someone who's sick, right? So someone who's sick and may become endangered if they don't eat now, you can feed. But a healthy person now, you can't just feed, right? Who says they're going to become sick even? They're not even sick. And so perhaps by pikuach nefesh, there's kind of a range. There's the person who is healthy. There's a person who is sick. There's a person who is sick who is in sakana. And there's a person who is sick who is not only in sakana, but it might die, right? And so at what point do you start saying pikuach nefesh lakel? Like, do you start saying it from the very beginning, a healthy person that might become sick? Or do you start saying it from a sick person? And he said you might say that this is only talking about a sick person, right? Second rung on the ladder, so to speak. And he says like this, he says, the mikevan shebashar zo ein ba adai mishum pikuach nefesh ashar achar zman yocholim ovdei kfiyah lavo leklal sakana v'kol makom batar hashta azlina v'asur lehem lechol. Right? He says you may even say that after time these workers are going to come into danger, but that doesn't mean now you already start doing pikuach nefesh things, right? And you have to go according to the situation now, what you see. You don't go according to what the situation might be tomorrow. Even if you say a sick person that may come to danger needs to eat, that's fine. But in our circumstances, we're talking about healthy people, and healthy people are not yet in danger, and so you might argue that. So that's kind of the challenge. And he says like this, he says we can bring up another proof for what we're talking about, whereby a healthy person is able to be concerned about a pikuach nefesh that will come, from this case in Masechet Shabbat. And the case is as follows. Rav Huna said someone was walking in the desert. He doesn't know when Shabbat comes out, right? He counts 6 days and keeps the 7th day as a Shabbat, right? In order that you shouldn't forget Shabbat. There's a machloket whether you keep Shabbat one day and then count 6 or vice versa. But then this is the focus. Amar Rabba bar b'kol yom v'yom oselo kedei parnasato bar me'amo yoma, right? Meaning, what about working, right? Someone is in the desert. If he doesn't work, eventually he's going to die, right? He's not going to have what to live by, but he doesn't know which day is Shabbat. So actually by him, every day is a possible Shabbat, right? And every day is a suffix Shabbat. The Rava says, in that case where he counts 6 days and keeps the 7th one as Shabbat, what he should do is he should work every day, whatever he needs, except for that day where he doesn't do any work. Uparchinan v'hu yoma limot, right? And the Gemara questions though and says, but on that day, when he doesn't work, he might die. He might not have enough money for food or whatever, or he might not have enough water, whatever it is. And therefore, even on that day, he has to do whatever he needs to do. Vaskinan shama, right? Vaskinan sham. Ela kol yom v'yom oselo parasato. Afilu hahu yoma. Rather, each day he does what he needs, even on that day, right? And then the Gemara asks, but that day, then why is it Shabbat? Why is that 7th day? How do you, and he says, how do you recognize it? B'kiddusha v'avdalata, right? By doing havdalah and making kiddush. And that's how the Rambam was posek, right? Meaning that even a healthy person who's going in the desert, right, there is a concern that on that day they might come and die. And therefore on that day, even though that's the 7th day that even, you're kind of keeping Shabbat, even on that day you need to work. Let's see how he expands this further down. And the Shulchan Aruch paskin, he paskins like that. Someone who goes in the desert doesn't know when Shabbat, he counts 7 days. And if he has from what to eat, or what to eat, the Shulchan Aruch says it's forbidden him to do any melacha until everything he has to eat goes. And then ve'az yaseh melacha. And then he starts working b'chol yom afilu b'yom shemekadesh bo kedei panasto. On that day, and at that time when he no longer has anything and he needs to work, right, work or do whatever he needs to do to survive, right, in that case, even on the day that is Shabbat, he needs to do work, right? And we'll see how this is explained later. And he said in another couple of lines, Vayim b'sefer Tosfot Shantz, shekatav that wrote the imu yacholit anot yom echad bli sakana asur lo asot melacha b'oto yom de'ein kam pikuach nefesh, right? And so the Tosfot Shantz seems to say that on that 7th day, right, if he's able to fast without coming into danger, he can't do any work on that day, right? Because there's no real case of pikuach nefesh. But then he says, Olam b'sefer bigdei yesha chalak alav. He disagreed. He wrote, he doesn't need to make himself have a ta'anit, right, to cause himself pain. Even if he doesn't become endangered from such a thing, he doesn't need to do that. In any case, he needs to get out of the desert as soon as possible. He needs to do whatever he needs to do. So even on the day which he's decided is the 7th day and is Shabbat, he eats and he needs to do whatever he needs to get out of the desert. And it becomes clear from his words that even though now there is no concern for pikuach nefesh, since he needs to get out of the desert, because if he doesn't leave the desert now, he's going to become into danger later. Even though the danger will be later, not now, will be later, he shouldn't fast now because he needs to get out of the desert. And even though he can fast and he won't die today, if he doesn't get out of the desert in 2 weeks, he's going to die. So in that case, even today, you need to do whatever you can in order to get out of the desert. שאחר כך יסתכל בסכנת הנפש, כבר מעכשיו מותר לאכול, therefore he's able to eat even today, because he's going to be in danger later. ואם כן, הוא הדין בנידון לדן. That's the case here. מותר להם לאכול מיד, כיוון שלאחר זמן יבואו לכלל סכנת נפש, right? It's possible to eat immediately now in the ghetto, even though they're not actually in danger now, even though they're not cholim, based on this concept that later on you're going to come into danger, and therefore that is what they should do. And he says, and perhaps we'll finish with this, right? There's another proof from the Tosefta on Shabbat, right? Milah dochin alea Shabbat, right? Why does Brit Milah dochet Shabbat, right? Why does it push off Shabbat? Right? Because people are obligated karet later on. You're not obligated karet now. You're obligated karet lachar zman, and therefore it is doche Shabbat. Right? And these things are kal v'chomer. If for one avar you doche the Shabbat, so too you doche Shabbat for something which is going to lead to his entire obliteration. And that is what Rashi says there in Yuma as well. Right? Meaning that according to this Gemara in this Tosefta and also the Rashi, right, that you push off Shabbat today, even though the punishment is only going to come lachar zman, and that also is analogous to our time, right? In the Kovno ghetto, the people need to eat now, even though later on they're only going to come into sakana, into danger. And he also writes here, v'gam gonav beit din the Kovna, the based in the Av Beit Din of Kovna, Rav Avram Dov Ber Kahana Shapira. He also agreed that that's what Jews should do, and people should eat now, even though later on it's going to become an issue. We won't read this inside, but just he writes here, right after the release from darkness to light, my friend Rav Agon Rav Asher Bavad, he showed me the Ritva, which also seems to argue in favor of this point. The pikuach nefesh lachar zman is enough of a reason already now to be concerned for isurim and to eat the soup. And so I think just to sum up, in terms of halacha and also in terms of some thoughts, and then maybe people can share. We see here a Rav who encounters a mikra that isn't an everyday mikra, right? So it's not a COVID mikra even, it's not, and COVID is out of the ordinary, but it's not chas v'shalom close to what the Jews of the ghetto did. And the role of a Rav is to be a leader and to look forward and to understand what it means for people in that situation now and perhaps later on, right? When and he didn't know what was going to happen, but once the Jews get moved around and the Jews start being sent to the camps, there aren't as many rabbanim to ask, and certainly not rabbanim with access to other rabbanim and svarim a little bit and this and that. And this hanchaya becomes crucial, right? This psak actually literally saves lives later on. And you see from here that he felt it was very important to go through the arguments. And, you could have just said, it's safed pikuach nefesh, lakel, right? He could have done that, right? But even here, he went through the arguments and explained why you might say that's only by cholet, but by a bari, and he found that, and he explained the Gemara, the Gemara in Shabbos, right? That someone's going b'midbar, and also the Tosefta about Brit Milah, that all seem to point that you're allowed to save your life now, even though later, even though the sakana is only going to come later. And in the end, that's how he paskin, and we saw he wasn't the only one paskin like that. And also we saw Rav Aronson, who also in public stood up and ate soup to show people this is what we need to do. He even made the bracha she'akol na'bid varo. because that is essentially what a leader needs to do, right? Wherever there's no leadership, you need to stand up and be a leader, not only in the realm of like, nefesh, but in the realm of actually arguing and showing and proving to people so that they actually go ahead and eat and do what needs to be done, do the right thing al pi halacha in order to strengthen themselves. And it always blows me away whenever I read these teshuvot, the kinds of questions that they dealt with, right? Not only the big questions, right, but even little questions and things that are seemingly irrelevant in times like that, right? And probably in many cases were irrelevant, right? You don't need to ask questions like that at those times, right? You just need to do whatever you need to do to survive. But the fact that even in such cases, the Jews connected to halacha on that level, right, is really an inspiration, right, in terms of what the halacha represents and should represent for us. And Imir Hashem, we should only be zoche never to experience such things, and to learn from such people and such events, and to continually grow in b'schutam and in their memory. Does anyone want to say anything?
Ravari, in your pre-Pesach share,